Preamble of the Constitution. The first famous three words, we the people. Now actually getting into the text of the Constitution itself, and believe it or not, that even the first sentence and even the first three words of the Constitution drew considerable controversy among people in the states, many of whom did not want to accept the Constitution. Now we'll look at why that was the case. First of all, and this is just in general, it's not probably the focal point of why people were suspicious of the words, we the people. But firstly, over the last 200 years or so, there has been an acceptance of the idea that government by the people has a moral legitimacy to it. That's good, the idea of people having a say in their government, exercising self-government, and things of that nature. However, underneath that assumption is often a presupposition which has several problems with it. And that presupposition that people often hold when talking about the moral legitimacy of democracy assumes that ultimate political authority is in the will of the people. This is one theoretical or philosophical perspective, is that underneath all political decisions, underneath democracy, underneath rule by the people, is the assumption that ultimate political authority rests in the will of the people. Now, there are several problems with that. However, one of the most obvious issues is if that is the case, if political power and the political authority that legitimizes the use of that power ultimately rests in the will of the people, then there is no objective truth. There is no objective ethical right and wrong. It is just what a grouping of individuals collectivized and identified as the people determine. Therefore, if that is the final authority to determine political right, political wrong, political truth, political lies, all those things, what that means is that whatever is said that the people will is allowable. Therefore, if it is decided, and there are different euphemisms for this, for example, like the common good, we the people, the will of the people, the majority will, the common will, all euphemistic statements for the legitimacy of the use of collective or government power, then it may be determined that any action done by the will of the people is allowable, including what we would view as rightly as crimes, murder, theft, slavery, kidnapping, rape, assault. Because if the will of the people is the political authority and all else must be subservient to that, then that means it will be allowable to harm real people, real individuals in the name of an imaginary common good, an imaginary people, an imaginary majority will, or even an actual majority will. And there are several problems with that, basing ultimate political authority in that, rather than natural rights. Now, several governments throughout history have done terrible, tyrannical things, all in the name of the people. And they justified horrific actions, overreaches of power, murder, slavery, en masse, all for the legitimacy of the state, which it termed as the people. But how do you represent? You think about America today, 327 million people. Do they all want the same thing? Do they even mostly want the same thing? Sometimes yes, but their desires and wishes and wills are different. There can, in the final analysis, not be a will of the people or a government of the people, because you would have to get the will of every single individual. Only individuals have wills, only individuals think, only individuals act. Even doing so collectively is a grouping of individuals. And so what the euphemism majority will, common good, government of the people, doing things in the name of the people, means in practicality is that a few elites in power take any actions they wish, and that those actions may be justified and rationalized because all of it is in the name of the people, the greater good, the common good, the majority will. And therefore, they may even commit crimes and injustices against real individuals by claiming that it will have an overall net benefit to others. So that's problem number one. Now, is that what the framers of the Constitution meant? No, I don't think so. And we think we can show that. But it should give us pause whenever anyone claims to speak in the name of the people and do whatever they want in the name of the people. Number two, and this is the primary issue that was had with the Constitution and the phrase "we the people," is the fact that these secret meetings of the Philadelphia Convention for 4 months that were meant to edit the articles wrote a proposal for government that would empower a national government with a vast amount of new powers. And in doing so, these 55 men or less, because not all of them signed the Constitution, these men claim to do this in the name of the people. And by doing so, if the Constitution was ratified, many people feared that this would be a government that would overrule and control the states. And in at least some ways, they were right. Because if you think about it, there is the state government of somewhere like Massachusetts, and then there's the US government. But if the US government claims to speak in name and representation of the American people, then that supersedes the authority of the state government of Massachusetts. And that would imply that the very principle for which the American Revolution had been fought and the Declaration of Independence had been written, the principle of the fact that the states could govern themselves as independent countries in an alliance with one another, that principle had been lost within a matter of years. So the stakes are very high. Let me talk through this issue a little bit more. Now, this is the preamble, long sentence introduction to the Constitution. There's a Schoolhouse Rock video that goes with this song. It helps people remember this. The text says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So, point out just a couple things here. This is why it's important to know the Articles of Confederation, because you can see the contrast in the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution that maintained the alliance of the states, claimed to be, in its full title, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union of the States. Now, the word perpetual, if you look it up, will mean ongoing or something that goes on continually or forever. However, perpetual, when it is used in a contract, means that there is no sunset provision or sunset clause, which means that there is no end date specified in the contract where the contract becomes invalid or void. And so all that the Articles of Confederation was claiming was that the Union of the States, the Confederation of the States, would be maintained so long as the states continued to be a part of it. Now, that only lasted a few years, obviously, till the states ratified the Constitution. And in the Constitution, they do not use the word perpetual. Oh, and by the way, one example of like a perpetual contract is like a marriage contract. People swear vows where they intend to stay married to death do us part. That is a perpetual contract where no end date is specified for the marriage. However, we know that that contract can be nullified through a divorce. So, similar to this. But the authors of the Constitution knew better now and did not intend to use the word perpetual. They avoided the use of that word and just said a more perfect union, recognizing the fact that the union of the Constitution may not exist forever. Now, it's existed for 200 years, and the Civil War is part of that as well, but you can see by what they leave out something of the expectations for the Constitution, that it may not have continued to exist into all eternity for the states. Things could change, and that's what they recognize by saying that. Now, the preamble simply announces the intention of the document. It does not give everything. It does not have legal clauses in it. It just announces what the document hopes to achieve. So it's important things to realize from some of the language of this time and how contracts work. A preamble is a declaration of intent at the beginning of a document. That's all it is. Now, the preamble section of a document is not legally binding. The preamble section of a document is not legally binding. So sometimes people try to argue the justification of government actions, laws, and programs from text of the preamble and try to say that this implicitly allows the federal government to do something. And while that argument could be questioned on a number of fronts, one of the most serious issues with it is that the preamble does not have legally binding clauses. It just announces the intention of the document. But after the Constitution was finished, people found issue with the first 3 words of the Constitution, which I mentioned. Many feared that this statement meant that the states were going to be effectively dissolved and that one central government would rule the whole people, which is exactly what they had fought against in the American Revolution. So this was seen as, by many, a betrayal of the American Revolution. I'm not asking anybody to adopt that view necessarily. I just want them to understand that this is how many people viewed it. The stakes were high on what was happening in the country at this time. And this was seen as making the revolution and the Declaration of Independence pointless, because the very point of the revolution was that the states could govern themselves, that they could act as self-governing countries, have local self-government that they could hold accountable. And while that is far from perfect, it was a dispersion of power. It was a limitation of power. It did have the governmental powers locally close, and it limited the scope of the damage that those governments could do. And the whole purpose of the Declaration of Independence had been that the colonies could become self-governing, sovereign, independent entities called states. Basically, think of it like their own country. Now, if there was a new US government that spoke in the name of all the American people, and the states were now to surrender their powers to this government once and for all, so that ultimately one government could rule, and while the states would continue to exist, the ultimate authority would be the US federal government, then many would view this as a total betrayal of the American Revolution, an abandonment of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And the government of, well, actually the government of the states, but the whole point of the revolution would have been lost. This is how many viewed it and why they did not like the words, "we the people." During this time, I'm actually going to relocate myself here. During this time, at the convention, the delegates from New York, at least 2 out of 3, not Alexander Hamilton, but these 2 other guys, John Lansing and Robert Yates, they actually left the convention because the convention was advertised to delegates of the states as an opportunity to edit the articles. However, these secret meetings for 4 months to edit the articles did not edit the articles. They set aside the articles and crafted together a document which would give a vast amount of new powers to a newly created US national government. And so 2 out of the 3 delegates from New York went home and they wrote a letter to their governor, George Clinton, saying that they knew that they no longer had permission to be there because of the nature of the change from editing the articles to writing a new constitution. And this is what they wrote. They said, "Our powers were explicit and confined to the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation," meaning we were there for one purpose. The orders from our state were clear, and we were not allowed to just do whatever we wanted, especially to write a constitution which we believe to be at the expense of our state of New York. That would have been treason. That would have been a betrayal of the trust that we held from the state of New York and the New York state government to represent them. So they went home. And this situation is kind of like I said earlier. Imagine we've all been in this situation or similar situation, or we know somebody, but imagine a teenager who gets permission from their parents to go to the library to study. Get to the library, they realize, oh, there's a lot of seats here that are taken, and they don't have all the books I need. It's not as good of an environment to study as the situation has changed reasonably. That happens. And then they see some other friends there, and they kind of want to hang out. Nothing wrong with that. And they go and decide they're going to go to Disneyland or go grab dinner or go to the beach. Any of those alternatives would be fine. And most of the time, parents, under the right circumstances, would allow for those things. If they had said, hey, notified them this is what we're doing, or even notified them that the plans had changed. But let's say a parent gives permission to go to the library, and then they get to the library, change their mind, and they go and get something to eat, go to Disneyland, go to the beach, whatever. The tension there that's now created is that they did something other than what they said they were going to do. And now imagine that with the states, especially in this case, the state of New York, sending delegates to edit the articles, and they came back, if they had instead not done what they were told to do by their state and written a whole new document that would, if the state accepted it, take over the powers of the state in many cases, that could have been viewed as a treasonous event, as a coup, as an overthrow of the state government. So they said our powers were explicit. And they go on, say the limited and well-defined powers under which we acted to revise the articles and which could not on any possible construction embrace an idea of such magnitude as to assent to a general constitution in subversion of that of the state. They said, if we participated in this, we felt like we would be creating a government that would undermine and subvert the state that we were there to represent. That we would basically be participating in building up a government that would take away power from the state of New York. And the state of New York sent us there for a totally different purpose. So they went home. And here's the kind of focal point of what their issue was. So you can imagine when they see the Constitution says, we the people, it's like their worst fears have been realized, that this is a government takeover. This is a power grab in their eyes. And they say, we must candidly confess that we should have been equally opposed to any system, however modified, which had in object the consolidation of the United States into one government. He said we would have objected to any type of system, no matter what the parameters were or the edits that were made or anything of that nature. We would have rejected them all if the whole plan is ultimately to consolidate all the governments into one government to rule them all, in Lord of the Rings terminology. Because not only would that have been a betrayal of the trust of New York in their estimation, but it would have been an undermining of the American Revolution, which had just recently been fought and won to win state independence from external government rule. And now, within a few years, the states, in some ways, replace what they had fought to eject from their shores.